Nobody ever gets quiet when I enter the room. This is great. Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the Christ College Symposium. Tonight is the fourth of our 5 speaker series symposia this year, each addressing this year's overarching theme, which is, what is justice? In both these monthly lecture-style symposia and in our weekly fireside symposia in the Muller Hall Commons, we've engaged throughout the year in vibrant and multifaceted conversation on one of the great human questions, the question of justice. This evening, in conjunction with Christ College's annual Shakespeare Week, we will hear a bit about what Mr. William Shakespeare had to say on this subject, or at least what his marvelous play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, brings forward for our consideration and our contemplation. After hearing tonight's talk, I hope that you will all be sure to attend one of this week's performances of A Midsummer Night's Dream, presented by the actors from the London stage, a troupe of actors from the United Kingdom, who are in residence with us here at VU for the entirety of Shakespeare Week. Tickets are still available through the VU Center for the Arts, for the box office for all 3 performances. This is Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So beginning tomorrow, and performances are at 7 p.m. For the past 2 years, the actors from the London stage have dazzled VALPO audiences. We had As You Like It a couple of years ago, and last year, I have to call it the Scottish play because I'm on a stage and I don't want to bring ill luck upon us here. The Scottish play last year. And I can't encourage you strongly enough to make sure that you attend one of the performances this time around. It's really exciting because if you haven't been to see them, they're 5 actors, but they do all the parts in the play. So they have to find creative ways to stage Shakespeare's plays. As a prelude to this experience, we have the great pleasure to have with us tonight our speaker, Dr. Virginia Lee Strain. Dr. Strain is an assistant professor of English at Loyola University, Chicago, where I knew her as a colleague before I came to Valpo 3 years ago. An expert in Shakespeare and the law, I was eager to invite her to address us on the topic of justice in Shakespeare. Dr. Strain has held teaching, research, and graduate fellowships at Vanderbilt University, Washington University in St. Louis, the Huntington Library, the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities, and the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies at Victoria College, University of Toronto. Her book project, the book that she's currently writing and finishing actually, it's very close to going to the publisher, is called Perfecting the Law, Literature and Legal Reform in Shakespeare's England. And it's based upon her dissertation, which won the J. Leeds Barrell Dissertation Prize from the Shakespeare Association of America. And she's published many articles in prestigious academic journals. In fact, the very first time I saw Dr. Strain, she won't remember this, but I was at the Shakespeare Association of America gathering in, I can't remember what the city was. They're all in some random conference room in cities across America. And imagine a sort of luncheon with about 1,000 Shakespearean scholars, all with their elbow patches and tuffled hair and stuff, and having lunch. And as part of the annual luncheon, they announce the award winner of the J. Leeds Barrell Dissertation Prize. So this is the dissertation that the Shakespeare Association of America has decided is the most accomplished PhD dissertation produced that year. And I remember very distinctly seeing Dr. Strain walk up and receive that prize just a few years ago. It was a great honor. So the title of her lecture this evening is, I'm going to turn around because it's changed since I printed this out just 30 minutes ago. It is on compromise and being compromised in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
I'd like to thank the Honors College and Dean Canalos in particular for this wonderful opportunity and invitation. I'm delighted to be here speaking tonight and joining up these 2 moments, Shakespeare Week and the Speaker Series. My talk tonight is inspired by three aspects of our immediate context here. First, the theme, as Dean Canelo said, what is justice? I'll be attacking a minor part of that. Second, the production of A Midsummer Night's Dream by the actors from the London stage. They are a fantastic group of actors. I've seen various incarnations of them at other universities. I do hope, along with the dean, that you'll be able to see them this week. The third inspiration is our political moment, not the presidential race, but the way in which compromise has been redefined in contemporary American politics. I do wish I had come up with a way to talk about the presidency or the presidential race, because as I was preparing this talk, I could not help thinking of Donald Trump in the role of Bottom the Weaver. The amateur actor who wants to play all the roles, right? You know, he would tell you that Shakespeare was a disaster, we're going to rewrite the play, it'll be huge. So that, I have to admit, Donald Trump as Bottom is a play I would pay good money to see, and this is why he's so successful. But tonight, instead, I'll be discussing the intermingling of personal and political compromise, as well as this elusive difference between a compromise and being compromised within A Midsummer Night's Dream. As Shakespeare's play illuminates, compromise is as foundational to political structures as it is foundational to personal relationships. His interest in the parallels between the personal and the political is no surprise. It was a cultural given. In the early modern era, what we used to call the Renaissance, men and women idealized a divinely ordained system in which, writes historian Kevin Sharp, from the highest sphere of the planets through the arrangements of societies, the composition of the individual and the hierarchy of beasts, a naturally appointed order was replicated. The result was the politicization of all aspects of life and the naturalization of political identities, relationships, and institutions. The language of treatises on the body, on the family, on horse riding, on music, on the government of cattle was highly political because each of these analogues and others corresponded in some way to the Commonwealth as it related to them. That's Kevin Sharp. Though this system was never descriptive of the world, it nevertheless presented a powerful normative depiction of it. These were the culture's ideals. Shifting gears to a more contemporary consideration, in Avishai Margolis's 2012 philosophical study on compromise and rotten compromises, it won 2 book awards. I suggest you check it out. Compromise is also equally the concern of the personal and the political, the individual and the community. Margolis argues that the concept of compromise should take center stage in micro-morality, dealing with individuals' interactions, as well as in macro-morality, dealing with political units. After all, writes Margolis, we very rarely attain what is first on our list of priorities, either as individuals or as collectives. We are forced by circumstances to settle for much less than what we aspire to. We compromise. We should be judged by our compromises more than by our ideals and norms. Ideals may tell us something important about what we should like to be, what we would like to be, but compromises tell us who we are. In fact, this is more true than Margolis even writes here. Margolis is talking about the moral or ethical content of those compromises they make and how they identify us. Alan Fumaresco goes further and suggests that actually reverting to compromise, the very practice of compromise, is idiosyncratically American. In his political and philosophical history of compromise, Fumarescu writes that in the English-speaking world at least, most politicians and theorists would agree that politics is the art of compromise. It's a very old saying. Politics is the art of compromise. And he continues that the Americans are particularly good at it. This is what we're known for. The structure of American government and the Constitution are regularly lauded as not only the grand outcomes of grand political compromises, but also as structures and that institutionalize compromise. Today, however, in popular culture, political compromise is so vilified that its foundational role in Anglo and American political institutions is all but forgotten. I'd like to show you a brief clip from a CBS interview with John Boehner from December 9, 2010, just as Boehner was about to replace Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. The intro to the interview goes like this. As 60 Minutes and correspondent Leslie Stahl set off to meet him, we had two questions. Which John Boehner will show up as Speaker? The compromiser that he's been in the past, or the more hardline conservative of late who's aligned himself with the Tea Party that helped bring him and his party into power?
Now is whether he can work things out with the president. At his news conference on Tuesday, Mr. Obama threw out a challenge.
Once John Boehner is sworn in as a speaker, then he's going to have responsibilities to govern. You can't just stand on the sidelines and be a bomb thrower.
We have to govern. That's what we were elected to do.
But governing means compromising.
It means working together.
It also means compromising.
It means finding common ground.
Okay, is that compromising?
I am not going to compromise on my principles, nor am I going to compromise the will of the American people.
You're saying I want common ground, but I'm not going to compromise. I don't understand that. I really don't.
When you say the word compromise, a lot of Americans look up and go, oh, they're going to sell me out. And so finding common ground, I think, makes more sense.
I reminded him that his goal had been to get all the Bush tax cuts made permanent. So you did compromise.
We found common ground.
You're afraid of the word.
I reject the word.
One reason is because half of his new members are Tea Partiers who think compromise is a dirty word, even when it comes to raising the national debt limit, which Mr. Boehner has said the new Congress will have to deal with as adults to keep the federal government from defaulting. Are you going to play the adult?
Okay, so there are a number of interesting things here, but you can see why I think that clip is powerful. He rejects the word. It's like it's a sex scandal, right? It's that he's so affronted. There are a number of interesting things here. First, compromise as a process is conflated with the idea of having one's principles compromised. And this is not distinct to any particular group. This is actually, according to several theorists, a result of the very structure of compromise. As Chiara Lapura of Doctors Without Borders has observed, because compromise involves at least one party, one person's sacrifice of a value or principle, the party is likely to feel morally compromised by the process. As the speaker says in the interview clip, when you say the word compromise, a lot of Americans look up and go, uh-oh, they're going to sell me out. The distinction between a compromise and being compromised is easily collapsed. And part of my objective tonight is to try to pry these concepts apart. But I think, as we'll see when we get into the play, they like to get glued back together. Boehner's rejection of the term is hardly unique. But his response to the problem of compromise, I think, is more novel and deserves consideration. And this gets me to my second point. He attempts to substitute another principle of conflict resolution or another principle for congressional practice, finding common ground. I think he clearly does not mean simply a rhetorical substitution here. It's not a synonym, but a different method for working all together, a form of negotiation that brackets off areas of disagreement. The most obvious problem with the common ground approach is that it provides no answer for those trenchant disagreements that may outnumber and be of much greater significance than the topics that we do agree upon. For example, the Illinois state legislature recently named pumpkin pie the state pie, I'm very proud. But if that were the only common ground that legislators could find, our state would be in a lot of trouble, except in October and November. Most importantly, the alternative here, finding common ground, reminds us that compromise is a choice. It is not the inevitable outcome of every and any kind of conflict. Rather, it's a political practice that has historically been chosen because of its advantages over other political practices. So I'd like to look more closely at the defining features of this practice and to give some weight to its positive characteristics that get little airtime today. This gets a little abstract, but then we'll go into Shakespeare's play. Compromise, in fact, inverts common ground thinking. As Lepore writes, it arises in contexts where irreconcilable claims must nonetheless somehow be resolved. It occurs when one or one set of laws, principles, values, goods is privileged over another in order to reach a resolution. In every real case of compromise, a sacrifice occurs as we voluntarily subject ourselves or one set of our values, etc., to an injustice. Yet this situation, despite the injustice, is also held to be more desirable and more just overall than the alternative of not compromising or doing nothing. It is a process by which we hope to arrive at the lesser of two or more evils. But there is an upside to this injustice, because that injustice within compromise actually signifies ongoing differences between the parties that have reached an agreement. One party, that is, does not collapse into the other. One side does not have to be rhetorically persuaded into thinking what and how the other side thinks. Identities are preserved, and that sacrifice, that injustice, that feeling of having been compromised is a sign of identity's persistence. The side that surrenders most has not been persuaded to alter their beliefs, but to give up its right to exert those beliefs or act upon them in the most desirable way. Compromise is thus in the service of individualism and otherness and value pluralism. The rest of my talk is devoted to compromise within the concrete example of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and not surprisingly, I will focus on the beginning and the end of the conflict in the play. Shakespeare's most famous romantic comedy begins with personal and political compromise. It begins by presenting marriage as a political and personal compromise. The first character to speak is Theseus, Duke of Athens, who has conquered the Amazons and taken their queen Hippolyta for his bride. On stage, they discuss their wedding night.
Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wings. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue.
4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. 4 nights will quickly dream away the time. And then the moon, like to a silver bow, new bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities.
Go, Philostrate, stir up the Athenian youth to merriments, awake the pert and nimble spirit of mirth. Turn melancholy forth to funerals. The pale companion is not for our pomp, my lord. Hippolyta, I wooed thee with my sword and won thy love doing the injuries, but I will win thee in another key, with pomp, with triumph, and with revelry.
The exchange here can be performed romantically as courtship, or alternatively as courtliness, as a form of verbal decorum associated with the royal court that, in this case, is thinly veiling the violent political circumstances that have brought these two characters together. I have only ever seen it performed romantically, but we do have records of productions that bring the political undercurrents to the surface. In 1966, the Actors Workshop Company in San Francisco brought Hippolyta on stage in a cage, while the BBC television production presents Hippolyta and Theseus facing off across a stage, Theseus still dressed in armor and ready for combat. Hippolyta, Theseus concludes, "I wooed thee with my sword and won thy love doing thee injuries, but I will wed thee in another key, with pomp, with triumph, and with reveling." Theseus presents here a version of Julius Caesar's Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, now translated into English and into an amorous context. I wooed, I won, I wed. Through the relationship between Theseus and Hippolyta, Shakespeare unmetaphors or literalizes the ancient comparison between courtship and war. Pomp and triumph and reveling sound like the public celebration of a military victory as much as or more than the celebration of a wedding. Regardless of their feelings for one another, Theseus and Hippolyta as rulers are expected to put political necessity above personal desire. Theseus has conquered the Amazons, and his marriage to their queen will reinforce his claim to sovereignty among them. He will be joined with the genealogical line that has a historical right to rule. Conquest and inheritance, two equal but diametrically opposed claims to sovereignty, will be united in this couple. This is the way royal weddings worked. At the end of Henry V, you might recall, Henry's wedding to Princess Catherine is written right into the agreement between England and France, right into the peace agreement. But historically, too, and when war or peace was not imminently at issue, royal marriages were always an opportunity for political alliances. While conquest has removed the Amazonian right to self-governance, marriage formally requires female as well as male consent. Hippolyta has chosen peace over battling to the bitter end or the complete annihilation of the Amazons. And the terms of this peace, represented by the marriage, have guaranteed her genealogical line's continuing claim to the throne and thus a continuing influence over Amazonian life and culture, and now potentially over Athenian culture. Finally, it is a peace that has a chance of corresponding with personal desire. After all, maybe she and Theseus, these two powerful warriors and rulers, really do get off on each other. In any case, their imminent marriage is supposed to represent to the Athenians and the Amazonians a successful political compromise and peace. This is its figurative value. From another perspective, however, the loss on Hippolyta's side may be too great for this marriage to represent a legitimate compromise. In this very specific case, marriage necessarily entails the eradication of female rule within what was an all-female community of Amazons. The Amazons were identified not with a specific geographical region, but through their distinct polity, composed exclusively of a female warrior class. The invasion of Theseus and his soldiers means, therefore, that a fundamental aspect of Amazonian identity has been lost. Heterosexual marriage and male rule among the Amazons amounts to cultural genocide. It's a hilarious play. As I said, a compromise in which one party to the agreement disappears, is annihilated, or fully assimilated with the other is not a proper compromise. If at first it appears that Theseus's conquest has metamorphosed into a mutually consenting marriage, marriage collapses back again into a form of conquest. Perhaps Hippolyta has not compromised so much as she has been compromised. So, in the very first lines of the play, we have marriage presented as a form of reconciliation, a political strategy that represents peace, but whose cost may nevertheless be too high for its female participants. It may be a compromise they should reconsider, and indeed the play is littered with references to and images of self-sufficient females, female friendship, or female communities that present viable alternatives to the heterosexual marriages that seem inescapable in romantic comedy. We meet an Amazon. We hear about cloistered nuns and widowed or single aunts. Helena's greatest monologue describes her intimate schoolgirl friendship with Hermia. And we hear about the fairy queen, Titania's relationship with her human servant and companion who has died in childbirth. In this play, marriage seems to destroy female independence and intimacy, and this is insinuated from the opening. I wooed thee with my sword is one of the last lines before the entrance of the next set of characters, none of whom are willing to compromise about their marriage choices. The exchange between Hippolyta and Theseus is cut short by the entrance of Aegeus, his daughter Hermia, and her two suitors, Lysander and Demetrius. While Theseus and Hippolyta evoke the poetic comparison between love and war, this new group of characters transforms suitors in love into suitors at law. This is Aegeus' complaint against his daughter.
Happy be Theseus, our renowned Duke.
Thanks, good Aegeus. What's the news with thee?
Full of vexation come I, with complaint against my child, my daughter Hermia. I shall stand forth, Demetrius. My noble lord, this man hath my consent to marry her. Stand forth, Lysander. And, my gracious Duke, this hath bewitched the bosom of my child. Thou, Lysander, thou hast given her rhymes and interchanged love tokens with my child. Thou hast by midnight at her window sung with feigning voice verses of feigning love, and stolen the impression of her fantasy with bracelets of thy hair, rings, gauds, conceits, knacks, trifles, nosegays, sweetmeats, messengers of strong prevailment in unhardened youth. With cunning hast thou filched my daughter's heart, turned her obedience, which is due to me, to stubborn harshness. And, my gracious Duke, be it so she will not hear before your grace consent to marry with Demetrius. I beg the ancient privilege of Athens. As she is mine, I may dispose of her. It shall be either to this or to her death, according to our law immediately provided in that case.
In most of the philosophical discussions on compromise, the writers or the theorists or the philosophers emphasize the fact that injustice happens when we sacrifice our principles to take pragmatic action. More commonly in Shakespeare, the reverse happens, that upholding a principle or a rule or a law ends up perpetrating an injustice. And that's what we have here in Aegeus. So while compromise entails the sacrifice of certain principles for pragmatic ends, Aegeus upholds his rights as a father and as an Athenian citizen in order to realize an impractical and short-sighted scheme. He wants to marry his daughter to a man of his choice when her affections have been bestowed elsewhere. Before we even hear Hermia speak, we know that Aegeus is in the wrong. He invokes an ancient privilege of Athens, or a very old law, that, we learn, allows a father to dispose of his daughter in marriage, or if she disobeys, subject her to death or pack her off to the convent. Over the course of the 16th century, statute law had built up to an unprecedented extent, and legal authorities, as well as many others, repeatedly voiced concerns over the exploitation of so-called ensnaring statutes, laws that were generally out of use, out of date, and obscure, and that could be used to legally entrap or injure subjects. When Aegeus takes the stage, I'm suggesting, it is to resort to this unethical but legally allowable strategy in order to entrap his own daughter. If we tend to think, oh, well, these historical audiences, they would have been on the side of the father, I don't think so. I think Aegeus would have come out clearly in the wrong from very early on, if not immediately in the play. It's not just that he's on the wrong side, he's against love, it's that he's a jerk. If that isn't bad enough that he's trying to legally entrap his own daughter, we soon learn that his choice for his daughter is, as Trump would say, a complete disaster. Demetrius is fickle. Despite the fact that he has wooed and won another noble maid, Helena, he dumps his first object of desire the minute he sees Hermia. We learn in Act 4 that Demetrius and Helena were, in fact, formally betrothed. In Shakespeare's day, to break a marriage engagement was a form of contract breaking, a source of extreme embarrassment to the individual who was dumped, and a source of dishonor to the person doing the dumping, unless serious circumstantial evidence was concerned. To break off an engagement either meant that she was a slut or he was a cad. Somebody's going to lose honor in this situation. So, not cool, Demetrius. Not only has Demetrius been a cad to Helena, but now he wants to come between two soulmates, Hermia and Lysander. He's that guy. Affronted by his daughter's disobedience, Aegeus would force this dubious youth on her for the rest of her life. This is quite short-sighted, right? So, as I said, through Aegeus, Shakespeare demonstrates the difference between rights. Aegeus has the upper hand as a father and at law, and justice. It would clearly be more ethical in this situation for Aegeus to compromise with Hermia. Having been introduced as a political authority in the opening moments of the play, Theseus is now addressed by Aegeus as a legal authority, and Theseus responds as an astute early modern or Renaissance magistrate might have done. He attempts to arbitrate rather than prosecute. First, he appeals to Hermia's sense of duty to her father, but Hermia will have none of Demetrius, despite her father's wishes. Theseus then lays out the terms of the law that he must uphold if she will not marry Demetrius. Either she must be put to death or become a nun. Recalling Hippolyta's personal history and circumstances, Hermia explains that she would sooner live and die a nun than, quote, yield my virgin patent up unto his lordship, whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give sovereignty. While Theseus says he will uphold the letter of the law, he says that he can by no means extenuate or mitigate the law. He is not primarily interested in activating or enforcing it, in bringing a crisis to a head and executing a young woman. Instead, the Duke gives Hermia the time until his own wedding day to come to a decision. He creates a delay between this impromptu trial and the delivery of judgment, giving the litigants another chance to sort out among themselves a non-legal resolution, to reach an agreement that is perhaps crafted by all parties involved and better for everyone involved. That's the opportunity. The time between now and what turns out to be everyone's wedding day transforms into a time for transformative negotiations. The most agreeable resolution, one that maximizes happiness for the group, however, does not mean a resolution in which everyone gets what they most desire. Hermia and Lysander come out of the woods, literally, in good but not unruffled shape. But Aegeus, Helena, and Demetrius must compromise if they are not, in fact, compromised. So now I'm going to go to the end of the play and figure out how this is all resolved. In Act 4, Theseus and Hippolyta's hunting party comes across and loudly awakens the four young lovers. Their night in the woods has left them exhausted, disoriented, but also reorganized into the happiest possible arrangement. Hermia and Lysander are back together, and Helena and Demetrius are back together. It looks like Theseus' strategy of giving everyone more time to sort things out has worked. I'm sorry, that's hard to see, but hopefully you can hear it. I might have just turned the sound off, so that'll help. Did I turn the sound off? Tech support? Am I not hitting play? There we go.
What nymphs are these? Oh, my lord. This is my daughter here asleep. And this, Lysander. And this Demetrius is, this Helena. Well, nay, does Helena. I wonder if they've been here together.
No doubt they rose up early to observe the rite of May, and hearing our intent, came here in grace of our solemnity. But speak, Aegeus, is not this the day that Hermia should give answer eventually?
It is, my lord.
Go with the huntsman, wake them with them. Good morrow, friends. St. Valentine is past. Begin these woodbirds to couple now.
Pardon, my lord.
I pray you all stand up. I know you two are rival enemies. How comes this gentle concord in the world, that hatred is so far from jealousy to sleep by hate and fear no enmity?
My lord, I shall reply amazedly, half asleep, half waking, but as yet I swear I cannot truly say how I came here. But as I think, for truly would I speak, and now do I bethink me, so it is. I came with Hermia hither. Our intent was to be gone from Athens, where we might, without the peril of the Athenian law.
Enough! Enough, my lord. You have enough. I beg the law upon his head. They would have stolen away, they would, Demetrius. Thereby to have defeated you and me. You of your wife, and me of my consent that she should be your wife.
My lord, fair Helen told me of their stealth, of this, their purpose hither to this wood, and I, in fury hither, followed them, fair Helena, in fancy, following me. But, my good lord, I wot not by what power, but by some power it is, my love to Hermia melted as the snow.
Huh?
It seems to me now as the remembrance of an idle bawd, which in my childhood I did dote upon, and all the faith, the virtue of my heart, the object and the pleasure of mine eye, is only Helena. To her, my lord, was I betrothed ere I saw Hermia. But like in sickness did I loathe this food. But as in health come to my natural taste, now I do wish it, love it, long for it, and will forevermore be true to it.
Fair lovers, you are fortunately met. Of this discourse we more will hear anon. Aegeus, I will overbear your will. For in the temple by and by with us these couples shall eternally be knit. And for the morning now is something worn, our purposed hunting shall be set aside. Away with us to Athens, 3 and 3, we'll hold a feast in great solemnity.
In a fairly few lines, the major conflicts that open the play have been resolved. I want to suggest in this scene, and I don't have much time to pull out all of the things going on in this large passage, I want to suggest that Theseus repeatedly shapes conflicts into the kind that can be resolved by compromise. He repeatedly frames or shapes conflict into a conflict of duties. So, for example, faced with a potentially scandalous situation, namely 4 unmarried lovers who seem to have been carousing all night long, the Duke tactfully redescribes their circumstances as a conflict of duties. His excuse for the lovers frames their behavior as the choice of one custom over another. No doubt they rose up early to observe the rite of May, and, hearing our intent, finding out that we intended to go hunting, came here in grace of our solemnity. They came here to show respect to their governors. The lovers, in Theseus's version, have chosen one tradition, the rite of May, and one duty to their royal governors over another duty to their parents and another tradition or social convention, i.e. the rule that dictates teenagers can't stay out all night getting up to no good. While this is a minor example, I think there's a pattern here in terms of Theseus's arbitration style. And it demonstrates also the role of compromise in face-saving, right? They look like they're very dutiful youths. They were just following a different priority. While the Duke helps the lovers save face here, there doesn't seem to be much that can be done about Aegeus's pig-headedness. The play makes clear that, far from being persuaded by the cause of love, Aegeus's principles and feelings have not altered by this time in the play, since the first act. Seeing Hermia and Lysander asleep next to each other, and many productions go out of their way to present the young couples as quite disheveled by this point, so that they really do have the morning after look about them. Seeing Hermia and Lysander asleep together, the enraged father initially protests, "I beg the law upon his head. They would have stolen away, they would, Demetrius, thereby to have defeated you and me, you of your wife, and me of my consent that she should be your wife." Deprived of his power of consent, or his desire, by Hermia and Lysander, Aegeus is then deprived of his legal right by Theseus. Aegeus, the Duke says, "I will overbear your will, for in the temple by and by with us these couples shall eternally be knit." Many critics, as well as students, have tried to account for the Duke's new willingness to overturn the law. In fact, I would argue, Theseus stays true to his initial claim in Act 1 that he by no means may extenuate or mitigate or suspend the law of Athens. Instead, Theseus has chosen to throw his political weight around finally, to coerce this aristocrat or statesman of some kind into adopting a particular policy or attitude toward the law and to a particular legal right. After initially using his power to delay the judgment and enforcement of the law, to give everyone a few days to reach a sensible conclusion, Theseus now removes the conflict from the legal forum altogether. Aegeus, he says, "I will overbear your will." Aegeus, we are to understand, will give up the benefit he perceives in demanding a legal right in order to avoid the greater social, political, and even economic repercussions of disobeying and angering his duke. Aegeus will act against one set of principles or interests to promote another set that is understood as more consequential. But Aegeus is not the only one who must give something up. The emphatic true love of Hermia and Lysander has proven to be capable of fissure. If you remember their night in the woods, Lysander is accidentally treated with the fairy love potion, and instead of staying with Hermia, he falls in love with Helena, temporarily. And because of that, their literary understanding of love, voiced when they are alone on stage in Act 1, when they talk about all they have heard or read about love, their literary understanding about love must be replaced by a more worldly perspective on the limitations of their self-knowledge and their knowledge of one another. More complexly, both Helena and Demetrius find themselves recommitted to one another with the full knowledge that Demetrius is a schmuck and entirely ignorant of the fact that his new devotion to Helena springs from a fairy love potion. He is the only one left in the play who is drugged at the end. Having colluded in Aegeus's attempts to suppress Hermia's free will, Demetrius's free will has been permanently compromised in the sense of infected. Helena has her Demetrius at last, but instead of the kind of energetic speech that we know she is capable of, she says enigmatically that having him back is like finding someone else's lost jewelry. And I have found Demetrius like a jewel. mine own and not mine own. The idea that two become one in love is expressed and analyzed and scrutinized throughout the love poetry of the Renaissance. Here, a different relationship model emerges, one that negotiates the contribution of distinct individuals, mostly in the form of individual weaknesses, to the collective we. Those individual contributions are what make compromise a necessary feature of our personal relationships. For Helena, Demetrius is mine own and not mine own. And this is where they're at as they head in to marriage. So where does marriage stand as an institution and as a compromise at the end of the play? Well, it still doesn't look great for women. As is often noted, the rhetorically exuberant Helena and Hermia are never heard from again. Once they are married, that is, they are silent. Giving up so much of one's identity simply to satisfy or to gratify sexual desires would be a very short-sighted compromise indeed. But Shakespeare makes it clear in the end that there is much more at stake than personal will and personal choice for these couples. Marriage was not only designed to organize our intimate relationships and to regulate sexual desire, it also creates children and parents. It is a compromise that leads to that wonderful metamorphosis. After the newly married aristocrats retire for the night, the fairies come on stage to bless the marriage beds. And the concentration on coupling and desire shifts to a focus on children and the future. This is Oberon, the king of the fairies. Sorry, I can't find my, there we go.
Now until the break of day, through this house each fairy stray. To the best bride bed will we, which by us shall blessed be, and the issue there create ever shall be fortunate. So shall all the couples three ever true in loving be, and the blots of nature's hand shall not in their issue stand. Never mole, hair lip, nor scar, nor mark prodigious such as are despised in nativity shall upon their children be. With this field due, consecrate. Every fairy take his king, and each several chamber bless, through this palace with sweet peace. And the owner of it blessed, ever shall in safety rest. Trip away, make no stay, meet me all by break of day.
I have discovered that the scholars of compromise are the best kind of serious thinkers. Many of them are concerned with the realities of war and especially peace. Trying to find a way forward in the face of human atrocities, they ask questions like, at what cost can we negotiate a peace settlement? And how much loss can we sustain before we are compromised by our compromises, or before we become implicated in more injustice? War and peace form the prehistory of Shakespeare's play. That is where I began my discussion. But I want to end here, not by thinking about losses, but, like Shakespeare's fairies and like Shakespeare's comedy, thinking about gains, about the transformative potential of a trade-off through which you may not get everything you desire when you desire it, but you may get more than you could ever have imagined. Thank you.